Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Commander Experience podcast. I'm one of your hosts, I'm Brian.
And I'm Jacob.
So, this is going to be the follow up episode talking about graveyards. Last time we talked about some of the pros and cons, and we talked about card draw versus self mill. And today we're going to go a little bit more specific into some of the cards that we're running, cards we don't think that is good enough for bracket 4, and some of the engines and payoffs. So, let's get into it.
Let's go.
So, just before we begin, a quick disclaimer regarding these episodes. This is, of course, our opinion, and they are all taken from a bracket force perspective. So, when we are talking about these cards, please keep that in mind that some of these cards may well be worth it running in bracket 2 or 3, where they will work perfectly fine, but the tempo is a bit fast in bracket 4, and we're taking that into account. Take anything with a grain of salt and keep playing your favorite cards. We're not here to talk you out of not playing the cards that you love. And also, there are way too many cards regarding graveyards to cover all of them. So we are talking about the cards that make sense from our perspective, the cards we see at our table that makes a big difference, or maybe the opposite of that. So also keep that in mind. It's just way too difficult to talk about all the cards. So if we skip your favorite one, tell us about it in the comments.
Yes, so let's start out with some cards that we run in our decks. And the first card I'm going to mention is a card that really overperformed, and it is Shifting Woodlands. I think it's one of these cards that, first of all, it's a land, and I don't know, I didn't really think much of it when I read it. I was like, seems like a decent value. 4 mana to reanimate something is kind of expensive in my brain. I was like, I can do it for 1 mana, reanimate dead. And then we started playing and it was just crazy. Yeah, one of the crazy things about this card is that by itself it can win. Both me and Brian has done this, where basically you can layer it in a way where you, for example, change it into squandered resources, sack all your lands, and then on top of that you make it into a aftermath analyst. And you do it in the way that first it gets into a squandered, sack everything, then an analyst, and then you can sack that and get all the lands back you did with the squandered resources. You also sack the Shifting Woodlands, you also get that back, and you could do it again and again and again if you have enough mana. So basically, if you have the right cards in your graveyard, you can win with just this land and enough mana. So that's pretty insane, and everything is uncounterable unless you get stifled. So.
Yeah, Shifting Woodlands was one of those cards where I saw its potential very early on, and I also think I was the first one running it in the pot. But it's still one of the cases where I was looking at Shifting Woodlands and thought, hey, this seems like a really strong card just from a value perspective. But when I put it in my deck and you told me about the combo that I didn't know about, I just saw its potential, and it performed even better than I'd ever dreamed about. One of my examples is in my Muldrotha decks, where I can turn Shifting Woodlands into a Displacer Kitten, because Displacer Kitten will usually always meet a counter spell if people have it, because I usually win when that gets on the battlefield. So being able to do that, and if people don't have any ways to stifle the ability, it will happen. That's just synergy that is hard to argue with. Also, in the Displacer Kitten's case, where you don't need to tap it or do anything else with it, Shifting Woodlands can pay one of the mana, because the activated abilities on Shifting Woodlands is not a tap ability. So now it's also paying 1 green into Displacer Kitten, where usually when you have utility lands, it's either or in most cases, where you have to tap for one ability or another ability, and you have to make up your mind and choose which one you want to do. But Shifting Woodlands, as far as I remember, is one of the only lands where you can do both.
Yeah.
So it's just very good land, and having access to all of your permanents in the graveyard, turning it into a greater good, or I've one time turned it into an opposition agent in response to somebody tutoring a card. So people will never see that coming, because you just have mana up. So yeah, it's a great land, and I think it's a staple.
Yeah, a quick after mention, just because I have been looking into this, that maybe you guys want to try this, but making Shifting Woodlands into Omniscient sounds pretty fun. So you can try that.
I hadn't thought about that.
Three mana Omniscient seems pretty good.
But now I am.
Yeah.
To mention some other cards where we don't want to go into too much details, also because we already talked a little bit about them already, is Life from the Loam. Cards like Entomb or by extension Unmarked Grave. Those are also, of course, some cards that we're running in our part. Intuition, Gifts Ungiven, in Graveyard Strategies, being able to put all the cards that you like to see in your graveyard straight into there is of course, cards we are playing that are just too strong to not be playing.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the next stops I want to talk about a bit is, because I think it might be a pet card, but let's see, is Honest Rodstein. So it's a Eternal Witness, but you can only get a permanent back, but also it makes every creature one cheaper. So I have put this in both my graveyard decks, and I know, of course, that you need to be Golgari, so it's kind of specific. But I think this card is a lot better, and no one is really talking about it. My guess it is basically free as well, monetary value here. So to me, it just reads so well. I don't mind the Eternal Witness. I will say it's not the best card anymore, but it's pretty decent. And the generic mana reduction is kind of rare on cards. And also, most or a lot of graveyard decks have a tendency to run a lot of creatures. So I think it's good.
Yeah. I'm actually not too sure about this one, but that's just a personal taste, I think. I think it's way too specific to say it's a card that I run, because I do think that you need to be into a very creature-heavy strategy and not just have your standard 25 creatures and that's good enough, because not only do you want to see creatures in your graveyard, but you want to see the creature cards that you need, because...
Yeah.
You need to get the correct creatures back from the graveyard. So if they get removed, you have an option to get them back. And there's also a bit of a controversial thing with this card, in my opinion, that makes me not liking it, because it kind of has two abilities that you want. You wanna keep it in hand and use on a opportune time where you need a creature card back that either got removed or self-mill. But you also want the reduction. So let's say you have a chance to playing it turn 2 to get creature reduction for all the upcoming turns. Now you're kind of sidestepping the other ability. You may not even have a creature card in your graveyard by the time you play it on turn 2. So it kind of want to do two things, and they don't complement each other. You want to cast them at two very different times.
Yeah.
So, but I do think there's a time and a place for running it. To run it generally when you have the colors is not something I'm doing. And I'm not running it on Muldrotha, I never have been. And I'm not running it in my Korum deck. There's just too many situations where it's not a creature I want to get back from the graveyard in those decks.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting. I think I would run it in the two decks you mentioned you don't run it in. I think where it's a bit iffy is in hard reanimator decks, where you reanimate a big creature, because... then you don't want to get it back with Honest Rodstein, so that ability is kind of wasted. It's kind of the same with Eternal Witness, where why would you put it in your hand if you can reanimate it for 1 mana? So it is a kind of weird spot where you want... is it really a reanimator card? Maybe it's just more I play a lot of creatures card, but I like it.
I definitely see the upside, but mostly for the reduction. But I guess that's the because of the flexibility that it can do two things. It doesn't have to complement each other, because in one situation one half is good, in other situations the other half is good, and maybe that's enough.
Yeah, I think you need to see it kind of as a modal card instead of having both things, because that's how it will play most of the time.
It is. But there's a lot of cards on the list that we run, and we're just going to mention a few of them here without going into too much details, because the cards are kind of explaining themselves, because they're generically good value cards. But some of them are Psychic Frog. Being able to draw and discard the cards you would like into your graveyard is awesome. And also you have a free discard outlet. Let's say you're playing Life from the Loam. You can dredge Life from the Loam to your hand and discard it to Psychic Frog for the upcoming turn and keep milling that way if that's what you want to do. But just the synergy of being able to put the cards you need into your graveyard and the cards you need in your hand into your hand is just great value. Legislator is kind of doing the same thing. Frantic Search is not a card I run in every deck, but I think you can run it in any graveyard deck, because you're basically playing it for free, and maybe even in some cases you're untapping a Guy's Cradle or something like that. A card I like to play, but it's a bit of a pet card, and I'm not really sure that you can play it general, but I like Euro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. It just gives so much value. And I do think that the life gain has come up more than one time when I'm playing it, where the free life that you're getting from both ETB and attacking can be enough to keep you out of harm's way to one ring or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting card. Where I think it's really cool is if you have something that makes you able to play it from your graveyard without using the escape cost, because then you can, if you make infinite mana for some reason, you can just keep replaying it from the graveyard and draw your whole deck. So in that way, it can also be a like payoff in the correct deck. And also it's pretty decent to mill and just escape it if you don't have anything else to do.
Yeah, and one of the utilities that I really like in my Muldrotha deck is that I run one Reanimator spell. So in some cases, if I have that in hand, I can let Muldrotha go to the graveyard. But in many cases, if that Reanimator spell now gets countered, you're out of luck. But with Euro in the graveyard, you can escape Muldrotha and now get him back to the command zone. So that's a utility I really like in those cases, that you have a way to make sure that Muldrotha change zones.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I haven't really thought about that much, but makes sense, yeah.
But to get on with the list, we like the Delve cards, of course. There's Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time, big value cards that's always been played in decks like this. And of course, if you're running Reanimator strategies, you're running the usual suspects like Reanimator and Animate Dead, Necromancy. Yeah. Incarnation Technique is a favorite of mine that has done real good work in my decks. And of course, Dread Return, if you have the decks for it. Those cards are slam dunk if you're running those sort of strategies. They don't need any further explanation, but we just thought we should mention them here. But I also know that you have a pet card in this category, Jacob, that maybe not all people are playing for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I guess actually I've told this. I have multiple pet cards in graveyard strategy, which is kind of interesting. I don't have a lot of graveyard decks, but one of my favorite cards that I really love playing, and maybe it's just because I own it, so I want to give it some time in the sun, is Chains of Mephistopheles. And like the short version of explaining why it's good is basically that it basically makes you loot every time you draw a card, besides the first card you draw each turn. So suddenly now when you're playing a Reanimator strategy, if you have let's just say Rhystic Study in play, suddenly now every time your Rhystic Study triggers, you discard a card and then draw a card. So now it's 2 cards you see, and that's of course a lot better for you than it is for everyone else because you are a graveyard deck. And it also have like the other mode, which is even better if you get there in the game, that if an opponent or you do not have any more cards in your hand, you start milling the top card instead of drawing. So now suddenly, if one of your opponents runs out of cards, they can't draw cards anymore. So very punishing, but very funny. Very fun if you are the graveyard deck at the table.
Yeah, and we should have mentioned here, of course, that the reason that nobody is running this is because of the price tag it comes with.
Yeah.
But if money is not an issue for you, maybe take another look. But it's on the reserve list, and it's a very expensive card. I'm not running it because I can't afford it. And if I could, I would probably use that money somewhere else on some other cards, I think.
Yeah, probably.
A few last cards we could mention for graveyard decks is Sevin's Reclamation is always doing great work, are used in combo decks, and graveyard strategies in general can get value pieces back, so that's a good one. It can also ramp you. Sorry?
Yeah, I was about to say it can also ramp you, and
yeah, it can even ramp you. And the last card that is a newer one is Icel Explorer. Not sure how good it is, but it does come with a landfall ability where you mill a card when a land enters. So, and being able to play lands out of the graveyards is value enough in itself. So I do think it's sort of a staple, but it still remains to be seen.
Yeah, it's interesting to see if it has a home outside landfall specific decks,
But let's move on to some of the cards that we don't think are good enough for Bracket 4, or at the very least are questionable to just run generically in graveyard strategies. I know that we have talked about this card on the channel before in other episodes, but one of the cards I really don't like is Ripples of Undeath, because in my opinion, it's only good in your opening hand. Anything else but that, drawing it turn 4 or 5, is just playing it 2 mana. It does nothing until tomorrow, and I'm just not a fan of it. I do have to say that I recently put it into my Corum deck, because with Corum in play, it just pseudo draws 3 cards. So I have chosen to run in that deck, and like I always say, there's always an exception to the rule. But I have to say that I was looking to make some substitutions, and funny enough, Ripples was just one of the cards I was looking at first. And does it do enough work? I'm still not sure if it's good enough in Quorum. And for me, if it's not good enough in Quorum, I'm having a difficult time to see what decks it is good enough in. But yeah, I know you like this a bit more than me.
Yeah, I think we had the talk in previous episode as well, where I also basically in the end said that it's probably not good enough. But starting this episode again, I looked into my graveyard decks and I still have it in both decks. So I don't know. I like it. I think it's maybe because it smells like Sylvan Library, and I think that card is still decently good. But as we said before earlier, that we mentioned it in an earlier episode that maybe it's just for graveyard deck that is not blue, because blue has better options. I think the part where you can also put it into hand for 1 mana is the one that gets me a bit, because I feel like it can mana fix you. And yeah, if your deck is only reanimating creatures and you suddenly see a very important card that you mill with that card, could be a reanimate, then it's pretty nice to pay that 1 mana to get reanimate to hand if one of the other cards was a 10 mana creature.
We talked a lot about this card, so I don't want to use too much of our podcast talking about this. But we're always talking about it already being on the battlefield, and the turn cycle has got around to you, and now it's doing good stuff. But there's just so many aspects of the game where it's not down on turn 1 or 2 or 3.
Yeah.
And as soon as you pass turn 3, you have seen what term our games end at the table.
Yep.
So as soon as you cross turn 3 and are not on the table, I think it's a dead card.
Pretty much.
I would much rather run Malevolent Rumble and just get that 1 permanent back in hand, because it does that every time you use that spell. Where Rebels is just like, am I gonna use 2 mana on this card turn 5? I don't think so. And if you do, it's because you have nothing else to do and you're already out of the game anyway. So
you are probably right. I don't know. I have a soft spot for engines in general, so.
And I do run it in that one deck, so the jury is still out on that one, I guess. But let's move on for that one, because I do think we can talk about that card for the rest of the episode.
Yeah.
Another card that I've tried over and over and over again is Miss Marigold, and I keep coming back to it. It's just not good enough. First of all, it's like Rebels. So it's 2 mana, do nothing on your turn, you have to wait, and even early on, it doesn't do a lot of work until later on when you untap more permanents. And then there's the whole, let's hope my opponents is not running graveyard decks, and then it's just pretty much a dead card in your deck, because I don't think it's worth it unless you're running something like Get Rot Frog as your commander, where every single trigger is helping you. I know there's an exception, and I do think that the single trigger on this Mesmeric Orb can in some cases be worth it. It's just, I don't like it.
Yeah, this is probably the one where I'm the most opposite. I think this is basically auto-include in every graveyard deck. I'm close to saying that this is the best mill piece ever printed. So I'm basically the other camp. Not only because we don't have to mention all the combos, blah, 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 it does a lot of that stuff, but just, I don't know, the radius seems insane to me, and I know it's Magic Charisma lands. Hey, if I have 10 permanents, they all tapped. I paid 2 mana to mill 10. Is that good? I don't even know, because it's an upkeep trigger, but I don't know. For me, it seems like it's just the best raid you get. And it has the same problems as Rebels, that it is delayed. But
I would rather run Rebels than Miss Marigold, to be honest. And that's because, at least with Rebels, you have the chance of mana fixing. Make sure you don't get lane stuck or something like that. Rebels have other options. And I can say that in my Emery deck, which is an artifact deck, I had Miss Marigold in along with Basalt Monolith. With those two, you have Infinite Mill. And I even took them out, first of all, because without both of the pieces, it just felt like none of them really did anything. And I know that in Emery, of course, you want to have as many permanents or artifacts in your graveyard as possible. But what I don't like about Miss Marigold is, in some sense, you have to watch out for Graveyard Hail also. And what you can't do with Miss Marigold and Rebels is controlling what cards end up in your graveyard. And that can be dangerous. And what I experienced with Mesmeric Orb is if it gets into a grindy game and suddenly you're putting like 20 cards into your graveyard, if people have graveyard hate, that's like half your library gone because you cannot control how many cards you're putting into your graveyard. And one last thing I would like to say is that I think that when a card is good, you will always remember one game or maybe even 10 games over a year where, wow, that game with Miss Marigold, that was awesome. It really did some work. And I never had that feeling with Miss Marigold, and I've tested it in a lot of decks. And yeah, it's putting cards into the bin and it's effective, but I never had that feeling where Miss Marigold was just MVP or something like that. And maybe it don't have to be a good card. Maybe it just needs to fly under the radar and do its thing. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not a big fan. I acknowledge that it's a great self-mill card. I would say that much.
Yeah, I love it. Also, just 2 generic mana. Like, I have that laying around every turn, basically. Probably not, but yeah, I don't know.
But half of my decks are graveyard decks.
I agree.
You must know, putting it into your decks, that there's a big chance that you're just helping out your opponents.
Definitely, and then I tutor Dorothy Whitewalker, and it's even better.
Oh, that's where you're just so much better than me at playing Magic.
Again, I think it's like part of the reason why I love it is the kind of Christmas land part of the card. It does so many things, so there's a lot of opportunity for being good, but also being bad.
Before moving on to the next one, we want to go into a little more details with. We're just going to mention some generically cards that we don't think are good enough in bracket 4, except, of course, if they are part of some core strategy. So what we're talking about is to just running them generically in a graveyard deck. So one of them is Out of the Tombs. Like we talked about with Ripples of Undeath, it's just way too slow, especially for 3 mana. It's just not going to do work quickly enough. Also Wheels. So Wheels of Fortune and Windfall, effects like that. If it's not part of your core strategy, helping out your opponents in that sort of way is just not good enough. That's real dangerous in bracket 4. That's 21 cards that you're just fueling your opponents with. That is very dangerous. Then there's effects like Splendid Reclamation and World Shaper. We don't think those effects are good enough if they're just in your deck generically.
Just to add to that effect real quick. If you want to play any of those effects, I think Loomer is the best one, and it's because you can reanimate him, and it's an ETB, so it happens immediately. So Loomer is MVP of that category.
I do agree. And some creatures that looks and play very much the same are Blossoming Tortoise, Barrow-Goyf, and Sun Titan. Too expensive and too slow. Even with haste, they're not really doing much. And one of them that we are kind of on the fence with, but we don't think is good enough, is Buried Alive. That is a very good card, and once again, I'm playing it in my Quorum deck. But I do think you have to have very specific creatures you need in your graveyard, and you need more than one. You do need like 10 creature cards that you would like to see in your graveyard, because with a self-milling strategy, if there's only really 3 creatures you want to see in your graveyard, by the chance you're casting this, 1 or 2 of them may already be in your graveyard, and now it's only fetching 1 creature you really want for 3 mana. But if you're running a creature-heavy deck, like 40 creatures, and there's a lot of them that you would like to see in your graveyard, so maybe it's good enough. The last one, before we are moving on to one of the cards we're going to go into a bit more detail with, is Eternal Witness, because by some extent, it looks a lot like Honest Rodstein that we talked about before. That was one of the cards that we'd like to run in our decks. But 3 mana for just one of the effects is just not enough. I guess that's the borderline that we draw between these cards, that one has the reduction and that makes it just good enough, and the other one does not.
Yeah, and I also think that it kind of is a fake graveyard card because it mentions the graveyard, but I think Eternal Witness is a lot better in non-graveyard decks because the graveyard deck has so many ways to get your cards back anyway, and this is kind of an expensive way to do it, and I know it's like catch-all because it's just this card, but most of the time in a graveyard deck you want to reanimate your 10 mana spell. You don't want to get it in your hand. So,
and if you want that effect, a card we didn't mention in the other category but is on our list is Noxious Revival. Yeah. So I do think that's the best in class. If you want that in a bracket 4 environment, you will only get to cast that once anyway, meaning that even if you by some way can exploit using a creature with that effect by blinking it or sacrificing and playing it again, it's usually not worth it in a bracket 4 environment. It's just way too slow.
Yeah.
Even in cases where you maybe be behind and you Eternal Witness for a Toxic Deluge, now you're using 6 mana to wipe the board and say pass turn, and by the time it gets round to you, you're behind again. So at least that's the experience in our part. Just too slow. But let's get to the next card on our list that we would like to go into a bit more details with. And that's also a card that we have talked about in early episode, and it's even been card of the episode, and that is 6.
Yeah, so once again, it's one of those cards where I'm probably on the other side of the fence. I think it's, as Ripples, I have also kind of agree with you that maybe it's not good enough. But again, I looked in my decks and it's still there. I will say that I have taken it out of my non-graveyard decks. When it got printed, I basically put it in every green deck and I was like, that seems good. That's not the case anymore, but I will say that all my graveyard decks that are green play 6, and I think it's a good card, and 3 mana, and it mills and fixes your landfall and also made you able to play stuff from the graveyard. I think it's still very good, but so I like it still. But it has the same issue as the previous card. It kind of does it in your upkeep. It doesn't, but you have to wait a turn to do it. So it has the same issues as the other card you didn't like.
Yeah, with the attack trigger, yes, but you can play cards out of the graveyard straight away.
That's true.
But kind of fun that you like 6, but you're not a huge fan of Life from the Loam, because Life from the Loam does fuel 6. So
yeah, it does. Yeah, I should maybe play it in the decks where I play 6, but
I will say, and this may be a funny take on this card, but one of the reasons that I kind of like 6 is that it has reach. It is actually a very decent blocker besides the other value it's giving your deck.
Yeah.
And I will say, out of the cards that we talked about that I don't think are good enough for bracket 4, 6 are the very closest. And I do think there are cases where 6 is good enough. And once again, I'm running it in Quorum. I guess my Quorum deck is the whole exception to the rule with cards I'm not running. But that's because there's just some value pieces in Quorum that I cannot do without. And the very reason that it can get a land back into your hand by attacking and fueling itself is nice. The reason I don't like it is that, as we talked about earlier, we do tend to run a very low land count. So I do think there are cases, and there has been cases for me, that I've had 6 in play, but it didn't have any lands in hand. So now again, it's a free mana do nothing, where at least Eternal Witness gets a card back. I do think that cards like this, I don't think it's enough that they're good on some occasion. I do think it has to be good every time you're playing it to play these sorts of cards. I don't think you can afford this being a dead card in hand.
Oh, I agree with that part at least. And as we have basically the conclusion we got in a lot of the other where we talked about these cards is that you are probably right. You also do play a lot of more graveyard decks, and most of your graveyard decks also is more successful than mine is. So it is interesting.
I also think it falls into the category where, and we've talked about this in private, where a card doesn't necessarily have to be bad for you not to be running it and saying it's not good enough. A card can be good and it's still not good enough.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that, like with Ripples, if you top deck 6, turn 4 or 5, we're usually playing in such a competitive meta where you don't really want to be playing 6 by that point. And I think that's has been the experience for me, where I will not say that 6 is having some bad effects. I think it reads really well, and this is what we all also said in our card of the episode when we evaluated the deck, that 6 are reading really well, but it doesn't play well. And I've had so many games where I had it in hand and it's just not the card I'm casting. So I think it's just not good enough to be in the deck, because most of the time you want to be doing other stuff.
Yeah, I would say that sentiment I agree with a lot. Basically every time I have cast 6, it is one of my first spells. And after that point, it's not really worth it anymore. So it just rots in my hand and I do other stuff exactly because it's delayed gratification with that card most of the time.
And also we are back to, and we also talked about this, where how many times do you think you're using 6 ability during a game?
Not many, 1 or 2 times probably.
1, maybe 2. I mean, definitely cards that does that effect better. So
Yeah.
like I said, I think it's a good card. I just don't think it's good enough. I will not say it's a bad card. I inherently think that Rebels of Undeath and Mesmeric Orb are way worse in that effect. But I think 6 is a better card, but just another example of when good is not good enough, at least for me.
It is kind of slow, so it has that in common with a lot of the other cards.
Yeah, and if you make the decision, and this is why I'm not running Rebels of Undeath and Mesmeric Orb and 6, because if you run all of them, now you're in the situations where you have 6 in hand, you're top decking Mesmeric Orb, and you have 2 cards in hand that does nothing now. So the more you run of these cards, the more you're putting yourself into a situations where you have so many cards in hand that doesn't really do anything, where you need cards that does something now. And I think I've preached this quite a lot regarding cards, that I think it's important in Bracket 4 that you're playing cards that are affecting the game now, because waiting another turn cycle is usually where you're losing the game. How many games have we not played where everyone are in the situations where everyone is kind of in this Mexican standoff and everyone can win, and we're trying to bait out counter spells and stuff like that. And this is just not the phase of the game where you're trying to cast 6 or Rebels of Undeath.
Yeah, I think it is one of those, these cards are in the category of cards where I know when I play them, at least most of the time, they feel kind of bad, but the dream is probably that the game doesn't end, and then I have the value engines there to outvalue everyone else.
Yeah, I think once again, and I do this in some decks, I would rather play Malevolent Rumble than one of these cards. At least it's only costing 1 mana, and I get to put a permanent in hand that may be the combo piece I need, either being Displacer Kitten or Lion's Eye Diamond or something like that. Anyway, that was all we had for this episode regarding cards we run in our meta and cards we don't think are good enough. In the next episode, we're going to cover some of the engines we see in graveyard decks, some of the payoffs, and how to protect your graveyards, and if it's even worth it. So tune in for the next episode, and until next time, thank you for watching.
Thanks for watching.